Red alert. Shields at maximum. All hands brace for impact. There is something out there, and it is unlike anything we have ever encountered before. That line could have come from any one of 79 episodes. But the story behind the show that produced it? That is stranger, more surprising, and more remarkable than almost anything that ever appeared on screen. Long before comic book universes colonized Hollywood, long before binge-watching became a national pastime, long before fandom had its own vocabulary, a low-budget science fiction show launched on a Thursday evening in the fall of 1966 and quietly began rewriting the future. It was called Star Trek. It was almost canceled before anyone noticed. And the story of how it survived, what it cost, who almost wasn't in it, and what it secretly meant, is the most fascinating behind-the-scenes saga in television history. These are 20 weird facts about Star Trek 1966 that will change how you see every episode. Number 1. The show almost had a completely different name. Before Gene Roddenberry settled on Star Trek, the project went through a graveyard of working titles that tell you just how uncertain the show's identity was in its earliest days. Among the names seriously considered were Wagon Train to the Stars, a nod to the popular Western serial that NBC already had on air and that Roddenberry explicitly used as a pitch reference. There was also Starship, Universe, and simply Roddenberry's Folly, which was the internal joke circulating among skeptical network executives who couldn't quite believe anyone was trying to make this show. The title Star Trek was chosen partly for its brevity, partly because it implied exploration rather than combat, and partly because NBC's research department believed the word star tested well with younger audiences. What none of them anticipated was that two words that nobody thought were special would become one of the most recognizable brand names in the history of entertainment. The title was almost changed again after the original pilot failed. Executives briefly floated Star Voyager. Roddenberry fought to keep his name. He won. Barely. Number 2. NBC forced Roddenberry to hire a comedy writer for the writer's room. Gene Roddenberry's vision for Star Trek was serious, philosophical, almost literary. He wanted stories about ideas, about the human condition, about moral complexity dressed up in the language of space exploration. NBC had a different concern. They were terrified the show would be too heavy for a primetime audience. Their solution was to mandate the hiring of a comedy writer who could inject lightness and humor into scripts that Roddenberry felt were already perfectly calibrated. The writer brought in was Gene Coon, who ended up being one of the most important creative forces in the show's history, not because he lightened anything, but because he had an instinctive understanding of character dynamics that made Kirk, Spock, and McCoy feel like a genuinely human trio rather than a collection of sci-fi archetypes. Coon created the Klingon, wrote some of the most beloved episodes of the entire run, and gave the show much of its wit. The comedy mandate backfired on NBC spectacularly. What they got wasn't laughs. They got depth. Coon wrote so fast, so prolifically, and so well that he became the show's unofficial second showrunner without ever holding the title. Number 3. Spock's famous hand gesture was Leonard Nimoy's invention, and it came from a synagogue. The Vulcan salute, the raised hand with the two middle fingers pressed together to form a V, is one of the most recognizable gestures in pop culture history. Billions of people have tried it. Millions have failed. What almost nobody knows is that Nimoy didn't invent it from scratch. He adapted it. As a child growing up in a Jewish household in Boston, Nimoy attended synagogue with his family. During the High Holy Day service, the Kohanim, the priestly class of the Jewish people, would extend their hands over the congregation in a blessing. The hand was shaped in exactly the pattern Nimoy later used as Spock's salute, fingers parted, thumb extended. It represented the Hebrew letter Shin, the first letter of Shaddai, one of the names of God. Nimoy told the director he had an idea for a Vulcan greeting, demonstrated it, and it was immediately accepted. The phrase "live long and prosper," which accompanied it, was Nimoy's own invention. He felt the Vulcans needed a farewell that sounded ancient, precise, and logical all at once. He wrote it himself in a few minutes between takes. The salute has since been immortalized on Nimoy's gravestone in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Number 4. The bridge set was built on a turntable so it could rotate for different shots. The bridge of the Enterprise is one of the most iconic sets in television history. The circular design, the wraparound view screen, the raised central command chair, it all feels effortlessly futuristic. What the camera never revealed was that the practical genius of the set lay underneath it. The entire bridge was constructed on a turntable mechanism that allowed it to rotate. This meant that a single camera position could be used to shoot scenes from multiple angles around the set simply by rotating the set itself rather than moving the camera, repositioning the lighting rig, or rebuilding sections of the structure. It saved an enormous amount of time on every shooting day. It also meant that the set felt spatially coherent on screen in a way that many other television sets of the era didn't, because the actors were always in the correct physical relationship to one another regardless of which direction the cameras were pointing. The set was designed by Matt Jeffries, the show's art director, whose other contribution to the franchise was the network of maintenance crawlways that ran through the ship. The crew nicknamed those crawlways Jeffries tubes. The name stuck, and it remains official Star Trek terminology to this day. Number 5. DeForest Kelley was offered the role of Spock before Leonard Nimoy. Before Leonard Nimoy was cast as the half-Vulcan science officer who would define the show's intellectual identity, Gene Roddenberry offered the role to DeForest Kelley, the actor who would eventually play Dr. Leonard McCoy. Kelley read for Spock, thought about it, and turned it down. His instinct was that he wasn't the right fit for a character defined by emotional suppression. Kelley was a warm, expressive performer whose natural register was empathy and feeling. He sensed that a role requiring the systematic removal of all emotional display would be a poor match for what he naturally brought to a scene. He was right both about himself and about Nimoy. What Roddenberry then did was offer Kelley the role of the ship's doctor, a character specifically designed to be the emotional counterweight to Spock's logic. The McCoy-Spock dynamic, which became the philosophical spine of the entire original series, was thus created partly by accident and partly by casting decisions that could easily have gone the other way. Had Kelley taken the Spock role, the show would have had a Spock who felt too human, and a McCoy who never existed. The argument at the heart of Star Trek, logic versus feeling, reason versus intuition, might never have been dramatized at all. Number 6. The show's theme music was almost entirely different. Alexander Courage composed the famous Star Trek theme, the soaring orchestral opening with the wordless soprano vocal that instantly signals a sense of vast, hopeful possibility. It is one of the most recognized pieces of music in television history. What almost nobody knows is that Gene Roddenberry, who was not a musician, quietly added lyrics to the theme after Courage had written it. Roddenberry did this not because he wanted a sung version but because, under the terms of the composer's contract, anyone who wrote lyrics to the tune was entitled to half the publishing royalties in perpetuity. By writing a set of largely unpublished, rarely performed lyrics to his own show's theme music, Roddenberry effectively claimed half of everything the composition ever earned. Courage was furious. He felt it was a legal maneuver dressed up as a creative one. He declined to score the second season as a direct result. NBC had to bring in other composers including Gerald Fried and Sol Kaplan to fill the gap. Courage eventually returned for the films, but the relationship was permanently altered. Roddenberry's lyrics were never used meaningfully in production. The money, however, was very real. Number 7. William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy initially had a difficult working relationship. The chemistry between Kirk and Spock on screen is so naturalistic, so apparently effortless, that it is easy to assume Shatner and Nimoy were natural collaborators from day one. The reality was more complicated. In the early weeks of production, the two actors were deeply uncertain about each other. Shatner was a classical stage actor with extensive Broadway credentials and a deeply competitive instinct. Nimoy was methodical, interior, and intensely focused on the internal logic of his character. Their approaches to a scene were different enough that early rehearsals were sometimes tense. Shatner later acknowledged that he initially found Nimoy's process opaque and occasionally frustrating. Nimoy, in interviews, described a period of mutual wariness before genuine respect developed. What changed things was the material. The scripts increasingly required the two characters to function as counterparts, each completing what the other lacked. As the characters depended on each other, the actors discovered that their differences were actually complementary rather than competitive. By the end of the first season, the friendship that would define both their public and private lives for the next 5 decades had genuinely taken root. Shatner delivered a eulogy at Nimoy's memorial service in 2015 that reduced the audience to silence. Number 8. Nichelle Nichols taught NASA how to recruit. After being persuaded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to remain on the show, Nichelle Nichols went on to have an impact on the real world that extended far beyond television. In 1977, NASA was struggling with a diversity problem. The astronaut corps was almost entirely composed of white men, and the agency's outreach efforts were failing to attract women or candidates from minority communities in meaningful numbers. NASA Administrator James Fletcher approached Nichols directly and asked for her help. She agreed and spent a year traveling the country on behalf of NASA, attending events in communities that NASA recruiters had never effectively reached, appearing at universities, conventions and community gatherings, and making a single argument: the future of space exploration belonged to everyone. The results were measurable and immediate. Among the candidates who joined NASA's astronaut program as a direct result of the recruitment drive were Dr. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space; Judith Resnick, Dr. Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman in space; and Mission Commander Frederick Gregory. Nichols later said it was the most important work she had ever done. Not acting. Recruiting. A fictional communications officer changed the composition of the real space program. Number 9. The Vulcan nerve pinch was invented because Nimoy refused to punch people. Early in the show's first season, a script called for Spock to knock out an enemy by striking him over the head in the conventional action television way. Nimoy read the scene and told the director he wouldn't do it. His reasoning was precise and in character. A Vulcan of Spock's intelligence and strength would not resort to blunt physical force when a more precise and efficient solution was available. He proposed an alternative. He would apply pressure to a specific point on the neck and shoulder, using a Vulcan understanding of humanoid physiology to induce instant unconsciousness. The director said, "Fine, show me." Nimoy demonstrated a grip. The stunt coordinator helped choreograph a reaction from the actor being rendered unconscious. The first take worked. The Vulcan nerve pinch was born entirely from one actor's refusal to do something that felt wrong for his character. It has since appeared in every iteration of Star Trek, has been extensively analyzed by physicians and martial arts practitioners, and inspired a real pressure point discipline sometimes called dim mak in Chinese martial arts tradition, though whether any of it actually works remains a matter of considerable debate. Number 10. The show's female costumes were a constant source of behind-the-scenes conflict. The miniskirt uniforms worn by female crew members on the Enterprise are among the most discussed costume choices in television history. What the public conversation often misses is how much internal debate they generated during production. Costume designer William Tice had a deliberate philosophy he called the Tice titillation theory. A costume is revealing not in proportion to how much skin it shows, but in proportion to how likely it seems the costume could fall off. The miniskirts were his most straightforward expression of this philosophy applied to standard uniform design. Several of the actresses, including Nichols, had complicated feelings about the costumes. They were physically uncomfortable under studio lighting, difficult to wear on set for 12-hour shooting days, and frequently created problems during action sequences. At least one actress, in an interview later in her career, described having to kneel down by crouching rather than bending at the waist for the entire run of her episodes. Roddenberry's stated justification was that in the progressive society of the 23rd century, women would choose to wear whatever they liked. The counterargument, which several cast members made privately, was that the choice appeared to be made by the costume department rather than the characters. The debate never fully resolved itself during the original series run. Number 11. The Enterprise's computer voice was Majel Barrett, Roddenberry's wife. Majel Barrett first appeared in Star Trek as Number 1, the female first officer in the original rejected pilot who was written out when NBC demanded changes to the cast. Roddenberry, who was romantically involved with Barrett and would marry her in 1969, found a way to keep her in the show. She was recast as Nurse Christine Chappell, a recurring character in the series. But her most enduring contribution to the franchise was invisible. Barrett provided the voice of the Enterprise's computer in the original series, a role she reprised in every subsequent Star Trek television series and filmed through the end of her life in 2008. Her voice became the definitive sound of Federation technology, patient, precise, and slightly formal in a way that felt both welcoming and authoritative. Before her death, she recorded voice sessions for the then-upcoming Star Trek film reboot so that the computer of the new Enterprise would still sound like her. J.J. Abrams honored the request. Majel Barrett's voice appears in the 2009 film. She passed away before it was released. Number 12. James Doohan, who played Scotty, had a missing finger he hid for the entire series. James Doohan served in the Royal Canadian Artillery during the Second World War and landed at Juno Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944. During the fighting that day he was shot 6 times. 4 bullets struck his leg. One struck his chest where it was stopped by a silver cigarette case. The 6th shot took off the middle finger of his right hand. Doohan survived, recovered, returned to civilian life, and eventually became an actor. When he was cast as Montgomery Scott, the Enterprise's chief engineer, the question of his missing finger presented a constant practical challenge. The solution was a combination of careful camera blocking, hand positioning during close-ups, and in some cases the use of prosthetic extensions for specific shots. Doohan was extraordinarily skilled at concealing the absence throughout 79 episodes and 6 films. In thousands of hours of Star Trek footage, the missing finger is visible in only a handful of frames. He rarely spoke about his war service publicly. Fellow cast members described him as deeply private about those years. When he died in 2005, flags were flown at half-staff at several Canadian military installations. Number 13. The show's fan mail operation became one of the largest in television history. By the end of the first season, Star Trek was receiving more fan correspondence per episode than almost any other show on American television, despite its modest ratings. The volume was so large that Paramount had to assign dedicated staff to manage it. Letters arrived from scientists, academics, military personnel, schoolchildren, and from a demographic that television had barely acknowledged existed: young women who were deeply invested in a science fiction program. The letters were analyzed by NBC's research department, who were bewildered by them. The typical Star Trek viewer, according to the network's data, didn't exist as a category they had previously identified. They were educated, curious, engaged, and disproportionately likely to write in with detailed, articulate, multi-page responses to individual episodes. One NBC executive reportedly described the fan base as the most literate and the most persistent in the history of the network, in a memo that framed both qualities as problems rather than assets. Those same qualities, literacy and persistence, were precisely what saved the show twice and eventually built a franchise worth billions of dollars. Number 14. Gene Roddenberry based the Prime Directive on a real anthropological debate. The Prime Directive, the rule forbidding Starfleet officers from interfering in the development of alien civilizations, is one of the most philosophically rich concepts in the entire franchise, and it was not invented casually. In the 1950s and 1960s, anthropologists and development economists were engaged in a fierce debate about the Western world's role in what was then called the Third World. One camp argued that technological and cultural intervention was a moral duty. The other argued that imposing outside systems on indigenous cultures caused irreversible harm regardless of the intention behind it. The debate was directly connected to the real-world consequences of colonialism, missionary activity, and post-war development programs that had produced outcomes ranging from mixed to catastrophic across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Roddenberry, who read widely and thought carefully about political philosophy, built the Prime Directive as a direct dramatization of this argument. He made the moral case against intervention not by stating it as a position but by showing its tension with the instinct to help, an instinct that Kirk frequently acted on in defiance of his own rules. The friction between the principle and the temptation was the point. It made for compelling television. It also made for genuine ethical philosophy dressed in a Starfleet uniform. Number 15. The show was heavily influenced by a magazine that no longer exists. Before Star Trek aired, before science fiction had achieved mainstream cultural respectability, the genre was largely confined to pulp magazines. The most influential of these was Astounding Science Fiction, later renamed Analog, edited for decades by a man named John W. Campbell. Campbell ran the magazine as an ideas laboratory, publishing stories by Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, and dozens of other writers who collectively defined what intelligent science fiction looked and felt like. Roddenberry was a devoted reader. The stories that appeared in Campbell's magazine during the 1940s and 1950s, stories about first contact, about the ethics of technological power, about artificial intelligence, about the relationship between exploration and exploitation, directly shaped the kinds of questions Roddenberry wanted Star Trek to ask. The writers he hired for the show included several who had also read and been shaped by those same magazines, creating a generational chain of intellectual influence that ran from pulp fiction through to primetime television. When you watch a Star Trek episode that asks a genuinely difficult moral question, you are often watching a question that was first posed in a pulp magazine story from 20 years earlier, filtered through Roddenberry's ambition to make it available to a mass audience. Number 16. The show pioneered the use of science consultants on television. Before Star Trek, science fiction on television was largely unconcerned with scientific accuracy. Rockets flew through sound-filled space. Alien atmospheres were always breathable. Radiation produced superpowers rather than tissue damage. Star Trek was different. Roddenberry hired scientific advisors and cultivated relationships with researchers at places like the RAND Corporation and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The show didn't always follow their advice, and it introduced its own share of physical impossibilities, but the attempt to ground speculation in real science was genuine and unprecedented for the medium. The use of stardate notation instead of conventional dates was a direct result of scientific input. The advisors pointed out that a ship traveling at relativistic speeds would experience time differently than Earth, making conventional date references meaningless. The medical equipment on the show was designed in consultation with doctors who were asked what a plausible 23rd century diagnostic device might look like. NASA engineers have since confirmed that the communicator, the tricorder, and the medical scanner all influenced the design of actual instruments. The consultative process Roddenberry established became the model for how scientifically ambitious television is made today. Number 17. The show was broadcast in dozens of countries where it was heavily censored. While American audiences watched Star Trek relatively unedited, international broadcasters imposed cuts that would baffle anyone familiar with the episodes as originally produced. In the United Kingdom, several episodes were delayed or modified because the BBC felt their content was unsuitable for broadcast before the watershed. In West Germany, Cold War allegories were identified and softened. In Japan, episodes dealing with themes of militarism and loyalty to the state were scrutinized carefully, and at least one was broadcast with an extended introduction explaining that the events depicted were fictional and not intended as commentary on contemporary Japan. In South Africa, under the apartheid government, the show was not broadcast at all during the original run, partly because of the racially integrated cast and partly because of the integrated command structure in which characters of different races held positions of equivalent authority and gave each other orders. The irony is that the same progressive values which made the show controversial in some markets were precisely the values that made it an enduring cultural phenomenon everywhere once those social and political contexts shifted. Number 18. The actors didn't know the show would become famous and signed contracts accordingly. When the cast of Star Trek signed their original contracts in 1966, they signed documents appropriate for a modestly budgeted science fiction television program with uncertain prospects. The concept of residuals, payments made to actors each time their work is rebroadcast, had been established in Hollywood by that point, but the idea that a canceled show would eventually generate 50 years of syndication income, merchandise licensing worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and a film franchise that grossed over $1 billion, was not something any contract lawyer in 1966 could reasonably have anticipated. Several cast members spent years fighting for compensation they felt reflected what the franchise had actually become rather than what their contracts had assumed it would be. DeForest Kelley lived modestly despite the show's extraordinary commercial success. George Takei and Nichelle Nichols have both spoken publicly about the gap between what they were paid and what the franchise earned. William Shatner, who had a more aggressive representation team, negotiated better terms for the film era. The original contracts are a case study in how creative agreements fail to anticipate the future, and how the people who made something great can end up owning very little of it. Number 19. The show has been linked to real technological patents. The connection between Star Trek's imagined technology and real-world invention goes deeper than cultural inspiration. Several engineers and inventors have cited specific Star Trek episodes as the direct creative prompt for patents they filed. Martin Cooper, the inventor of the mobile phone, has said publicly that the communicator was what he wanted to build, not as a metaphor, not as a tribute, but as a literal engineering goal. He wanted a device that looked and functioned like the one he had seen on television. The folding form factor of the original communicator was replicated almost exactly in the first generation of flip phones. The tablet computer's resemblance to the PADD, personal access display device, used by crew members in the next generation and visible in primitive form in the original series, has been formally noted in patent litigation. In 2012, Samsung used original series Star Trek footage as evidence in a court filing related to its legal dispute with Apple, arguing that flat rectangular touchscreen devices had already been depicted in popular culture before either company's products existed. The judge ruled the evidence inadmissible. The fact that it was introduced at all says something remarkable about the distance a television prop had traveled. Number 20. The show's greatest achievement may be the future it convinced people was worth having. Here is the fact that ties all the others together, and the one that is hardest to measure. Star Trek, in its original run, reached an audience of tens of millions of people at a moment in American history when the future looked genuinely frightening. In 1966, the United States was escalating its involvement in Vietnam. Cities were burning. The Cold War was at its most anxious. Assassinations had taken some of the country's most important voices. The mood was dark, and the direction of history felt uncertain. Into that context, Gene Roddenberry placed a ship with a racially integrated crew, a half-alien science officer, and a premise that said, humanity survives. Not just survives. Reaches the stars. works together. Build something worth building. The show didn't just entertain. It offered a specific vision of the future as a place worth going. It said that the problems of the present were soluble, that diversity was the mechanism of survival rather than the source of conflict, that curiosity was more powerful than fear. Millions of scientists, engineers, doctors, astronauts, and ordinary people have said in interviews, memoirs, and public statements that Star Trek told them the future was worth reaching for. Some of them spent their careers building pieces of it. If a television show can do that, can genuinely alter the direction of human ambition, then the question of whether it was a hit in its original run is almost beside the point. It was something rarer. It was right. Outro. 20 facts. 20 windows into a production that had no money, faced constant cancellation, and employed actors who had no idea they were making history. The sets were plywood. The costumes were recycled. The budget would embarrass a student film by today's standards. And none of it mattered because the ideas were real, the performances were committed, and the vision of what humanity could be was drawn with enough clarity that people recognized it as something worth fighting for. Gene Roddenberry didn't just make a television show. He built a myth. And like all great myths, it described not the world as it was, but the world as it was possible to become. If this video sparked something in you, leave a comment with the fact that hit hardest. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about the shows and films that quietly changed everything. We'll see you in the next one.